Hussein. I am a cloud solution architect. I've been in Microsoft for 6 years now. And when I joined Microsoft, I was a Linux person working on AWS technologies in 2016, and I got hired into Microsoft to sort of help customers that were on-prem using non-Microsoft technologies or on competitive cloud moving, and my task was to help them move into Azure. So, I sort of I was part of that wave early on in Azure, where we wanted to make it available and inclusive of a platform for technologies, not just Microsoft technologies. So as Ron mentioned, we've come a long way from that time, and we are Microsoft is one of the leading contributors to open source. In terms of the agenda, you've heard a lot about cloud native, Kubernetes, different platforms, how they look at those problems. I want to take a I want to bridge that with how sort of Microsoft looks at that technology and what are the obstacles that we've seen in the industry and the use cases around that technology as it relates to adopting it in a hybrid world. And what is it that Microsoft brings to the table to try to solve for that problem? So with that, let me sort of set the the context, right? Like what is it that we're hearing from enterprise customers, right? And the reality of the matter is, for a lot of our customers, they have tens, if not thousands, of applications running. Business applications, mission critical applications, backend applications, and utilizing all kinds of frameworks and underlying technology stacks. That's just the reality of what organizations have to deal with today. The second component is obviously a very diverse set of infrastructure. Data centers, branch offices. I now work on Coca-Cola account team. So, a lot of warehouses, a lot of plants, edge use cases, along with the traditional data center hoster hardware as well. And then the third is obviously hybrid and multi-cloud as well, right? Like you heard from AWS speakers, you heard from Google speakers, you're hearing from Microsoft, and our supporting partners that help take the value add to the next level, right? And what do organizations, what kind of problems do they run into, right? Well, they have to operate in this disparate network environments, right? That's just the reality of it. And how do they sort of ensure, and the Checkpoint speaker spoke to this as well. How do you ensure that security is a core principle across the entire organization with all of these different environments out there? And for a lot of our customers, they do operate in a regulatory environment, right? Whether it's finance, banking, or government. That's just the reality of what they have to deal with. And you have to do this all without sort of compromising on the developers' agility and the innovation that's occurring within the cloud native space, right? So this is maybe less so for startups, but certainly is the reality of today's enterprise world. So, and here's just some stats from recently, right? 90% of enterprises remain hybrid. They started out hybrid. They have adopted cloud, maybe one or versus the other, and 93% of those enterprises are going to eventually land in a multi-cloud strategy, right? And it makes sense. If I was a customer, I would have done the same thing, right? Like if let the best service win with the best cost, right? That's just the reality. Now, some of the key drivers I talked about already, right? Like what legacy systems, custom requirements, regulations, latency. Sometimes it's just a reality of dealing with speed of light, right? Like that's just it is what it is. So and unfortunately, a lot of times, especially in the non-software businesses. So I used to work on with partners, as I said, and I dealt with a lot of ISVs. Their core business revolves around software. So they're very efficient and put a lot of resources on making that software as efficient as possible. As you can imagine, as you go away from that core business and into, let's say, an organization that is in the business of putting soda in a can and giving it to the customer, their core priority is not software, right? And they may or may not have been as proactive depending on the industry they're in, right? So these are just some of the key drivers that lead to having a hybrid strategy. So there's a need to having one consistent platform for hybrid and multi-cloud, right? Being able to do operations, governance, and security across all of these environments. So we have this technology called Azure Arc, and it's sort of an umbrella a set of technologies that extend the Azure control plane, and the services that operate on that control plane, and extend that into where your infrastructure is. And that infrastructure, as you can see here, it could be AWS, it could be GCP, it could be VMware, it could be Azure Stack ACI, or any along with a suite of other bare metal as well, right? So that's the infrastructure that a provider for you. That's fine. What Azure Arc does is that it brings the Azure services to that infrastructure. Now, within Azure, Microsoft has sort of divided up the technology into three components. One is Azure Arc Enable, and I'm going to double click into all of these as well. One of them is called Azure Arc Enabled Infrastructure, which includes Azure Arc servers, Kubernetes, and SQL servers as well. I'll touch on them momentarily here quickly. The second set of technologies revolves around Azure Arc Enabled services. So historically, what we've asked customers to do is if they wanted to use any of our PaaS services, right? Like whether it's app service, whether it's AKS, whether it's functions, all of these cloud native services that Microsoft has built, the requirement historically is for the customer to come onto the Azure platform and utilize Microsoft data centers, regions to utilize those services. Here, what we've done is we've taken that same service, we've packaged it up in such a way, aka Kubernetes. Kubernetes is the underlying platform that we package these up PaaS services and then allow it to be run on that underlying infrastructure that you may have already, or enterprises that may have already procured through a competitive cloud or on-prem, right? So that's the second set of services. The third set of services are Azure Arc enabled data and ML services. And I'm sure you've heard ChatGPT, OpenAI projects. A lot of them can be deployed using this as well, and it is part of that model. So let me. And if there are any questions, please feel free to type them in. I'm happy to do a follow-up or answer any while I can. So what are the different scenarios that we see for Azure Arc, right? One, obviously, it starts with security and governance. Second is dev tools and practices. Third is application data and ML services. So let's start off with security, right? So the reality is you want to be able to secure and improve your security posture, right? And how do you do that even without Azure Arc? What you would do is obviously identity is a big component, right? So your DevSecOps teams in enterprises have an identity system, regardless of whether it's Okta or AD as it is in Azure. It's not good enough to just have the identity. You need to be able to apply access and protection capability for that identity. Who can access what, when, and where, right? And then it's great that you have that ability, but you still want to be able to take intelligent actions with Azure Sentinel as well, and then have that be sort of across all of the globe, wherever you may be implementing, and not have a diverse set of features in region to region. You can do all of that on Azure. As I said earlier, the objective of Azure Arc is to be able to take that same flow and then be able to run it in your environment, aka multi-cloud, data center, or edge for that matter, right? So now you can do the same flow for servers that are actually on-prem, right, or are actually on AWS or GCP for that matter, right? So that's one use case. Similarly, for governance and compliance, right? So Azure for IT and ops teams, you want to be able to, for example, very common is protecting SSH ports or limiting exposure to those ports, SSH or RDP 3389. Regardless of either one of them, you want to make sure that you're protected from it. Now, you can do that for Azure deployed VMs, but now you can apply that same policy in an automated fashion on a VM running on-prem, for example, right? Regardless of whether it's a bare metal or a virtual machine. And then same goes for competitive clouds as well. So here's another example of having the guardrails that help you scale to mitigate risk and errors as well. That's just one example. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of policies built in, and the ability to apply custom policies as well. Arc enabled servers is another core component, right? So I mentioned you can install a bunch of services on a VM that's deployed in Azure, but we know that customers want to utilize these services for servers that are not deployed in Azure, right? So, I talked about reach, being able to configure them, being able to govern them, and then being able to secure them. All of those suite of services and features within the services that allow a customer to do that, all of that is made available for servers that are deployed outside of Azure as well, right? We also know the reality of on-prem, especially, is VMware. VMware has a large market share in the industry, and a lot of our enterprises utilize VMware. So what Azure Arc does is it installs an appliance that interacts with the VMware API directly, and then now we allow the customer can use the Azure portal to do lifecycle management, self-serve operations, and a single pane of glass to allow the customer to manage, and obviously as well as all the Azure management services as well. So that's around the servers component. The second use case that I talked about is dev tools, tools and practices, right? So we know as app developers, and this is applicable especially for startups and enterprises as well now, where they're familiar with existing tools, right? Whether it's Kubernetes, all the other cloud native great projects out there, but source control being GitHub, or really any Git for that matter. How do you take that and not have to change your deployment model, the way that you package up your CI and your CD, and still have the target be something else, right? So let's say you've developed an application on Kubernetes for AWS. How do you make sure that you deploy that on-prem? Well, Azure Arc is one way of doing it. You develop the application once, and you can use that same API and the same package and deploy it to cross-platform as well. So that's a little bit about that. The underlying technology that makes that possible is the Arc-enabled Kubernetes, right? So any infrastructure with any Kubernetes, you can Arc-enable it, and then from there, it's connected to the Azure control plane, and you can now configure it, you can monitor it, you can operate it, and then obviously apply all the security tools to be able to govern and secure that. including Defender, Sentinel, along with RBAC policies, and obviously identity as well. So that's the Arc enabled Kubernetes. The other big one is obviously data and ML services, right? And the scenario here is, as you can imagine, being able to do this in real time at the edge, right? So as a data scientist, you now have the ability to deploy deploy models and based on data at the edge, right? And train them, inference them, and then apply intelligently by creating APIs or making them part of your application right on the edge, all from the control plane of Azure, right? So that's the other component. Now, obviously, in order to deploy at the edge, these ML services, you need to be able to run data and store data at the edge as well, right? And that's where our Azure Arc enabled data services come in. We obviously have Azure SQL, which is a managed service, and historically for customers, we would have required them if they wanted a managed SQL to be able to run them on Azure or AWS or GCP for that matter, right? Now, if they have investments on hardware already, you can have SQL in a managed fashion, Azure SQL in a managed with a managed SLA on that same hardware, right? And then Postgres is the other technology that is in preview and will soon be released in GA as well. And again, the idea is to be able to have that same SLA that customers get on Azure owned and operated hardware, as well as on the customer owned and operated hardware. So that's Azure Arc data services. Next one is Azure Arc enabled application services, right? So whether it's app services, functions, logic apps, and a lot of these technologies, similar technologies were talked about with other speakers as well. Now you have the ability to, again, run them on the edge while having that control plane still being on Azure. So as dev teams, regardless of enterprise or startup, now you have the ability to run that and manage that and package that all once and deploy it many times. You're probably seeing a common theme, right? And last one I'll touch is the Azure Arc enabled machine learning. As I talked about it, we have Azure machine learning tooling for the Azure portal. You can use that, create models in the cloud with the data that's in the cloud and apply those models at the edge and use the data at the edge to retrain, inference your models, and then update those models and deploy them right at the edge without having to leave the Azure portal or the control plane that Azure has to offer. Now, I've talked a lot about the hardware component. Here's an example of sort of the full Microsoft SLA from all the way from hardware layer all the way to cloud native applications, right? And the traditional model was you have hardware, you have some sort of hypervisor running, VMware or Hyper-V. Now you have the ability to have your own hardware, you have the ability to run Azure Stack HCI, and historically you would run VMs really, and then some VM applications, right? SAP, Exchange, SharePoint, and others. Now, this is the new component here with Azure Arc. Now with Azure Stack HCI, you can get AKS with a managed service as a managed service with SLA on that same investment, right? And with that, it will allow you to run containers as well as Arc-enabled data services and cloud native applications that I talked about as well. And Azure Arc is sort of the plumbing that makes it all possible, right? And just for reference, here are some of the different form factors that we've seen customers utilize for different use cases, right? Obviously, and we've seen all of them deployed in retail industry as well as others. With that, we do have a complete set of guidelines that we've created in the form of Cloud Adoption Framework. It's very detailed with a lot of good use cases, architecture references, best practices, and technical documentation as well. It's a whole framework that we've created around how to help customers adopt cloud. And in this case, an augment of that is hybrid cloud, right? So here's, and I'll make these slides available later with Ron. Specifically around Azure Arc, here are some links that, again, I'll share with Ron that you can dive a little bit more into as required. With that, I want to be cautious of time, and I wanted to thank everyone.